My name is Lane Stone, and I'd like to tell you about two men with similar names but very different lives. I'll tell you how their stories intersected in a court case over a painting. The answer to a claim of authenticity of a painting by a living artist would seem to be black and white, right? And art authenticity claims usually against appraisers or dealers. Was this painting by Peter Doig or Pete Doig? The answer would be worth millions. To prove a negative, artist Peter Doig would pay legal fees in the seven figures. In 1976, Pete Doig was a student at Lakehead University in Ontario. Corrections officer Robert Fletcher met him at the college and recalls him being a Scotsman. Pete stopped attending, and the next time the two saw each other was at Thunder Bay Correctional Center, when Pete was serving time for two convictions, armed robbery and possession of LSD. The prison had an art program, and he began taking lessons. In the course of 5 or 6 months, he painted the painting in this graph, and as Robert Fletcher made his rounds, he saw it in various stages of completion. Then Mr. Fletcher helped him apply for parole and became his parole officer. Mr. Fletcher told Pete Doig that he should try to sell his paintings. He testified that he remembers Pete answering who would buy them. Fletcher answered that he would, and he bought the painting from him for $100. In 1977, he was released, and Mr. Fletcher didn't see him again until the next year. He came to the house with two friends to take a photograph of the painting for his art school application. As far as we know, Pete Doig never made it to art school. He died in 2012 of hepatitis and cirrhosis of the liver. The artist, Peter Doig, whose new magical landscapes sell for between $300,000 and $3 million, lived with his parents from 1975 until 1979, except for a period in 1976 when he set out for Western Canada. He worked on gas rigs, and according to a New York Times article, he slept in barns and on abandoned farms. He roams around the isolated prairies of Canada, which he would list as an important influence for his art. By his own admission, he experiments with LSD. In 1979, he leaves for London, where he would attend St. Martin's School of Art. He moves to Trinidad in 2002. Meanwhile, Mr. Fletcher has the painting hanging above his fireplace. Around 2011, a friend sees it and tells him he believes the painting is a quite valuable Doig. Mr. Fletcher sends a photo of it to Sotheby's. Olivia Thornton responds, "Your work has the trademark eeriness of the empty landscape and a stratified composition which recalls his later work." Fletcher tells his brother, who lives in Chicago, about the letter. The brother knows of a gallery, and Mr. Fletcher consigns it to Peter Barlow's gallery. Mr. Barlow contacts Peter Doig, and the query was forwarded to his dealer at the prestigious Michael Werner Galleries, who immediately threatened a lawsuit if he persisted in claiming Mr. Doig as the artist. Barlow also contacted an auctioneer, and the wheels were set in motion. Mr. Doig's associates informed the Leslie Hinman auctioneers that this was not his work, and the auction was halted. On April 20th, 2013, Robert Fletcher and Mr. Barlow filed suit for $7.9 million in damages and a court declaration of the painting's authenticity. They were suing not only Mr. Doig, but his attorney and his dealer for interfering with their contract to auction the painting. Mr. Doig answered with a motion to exempt the attorney and the dealer and for a summary judgment, that is, to drop the case. On September 30th, 2014, the judge ruled that these two men should be dropped from the suit, but further, the judge ruled that this case could only be decided in trial and set a date. It was that time period in 1976 when Peter Doig was traveling around that created just enough doubt for a judge to deny this motion for a summary judgment. In late 2015, Doig filed for Mr. Bartlow and appraiser Victor Weiner to be excluded as expert witnesses for the plaintiffs. In July 2016, the judge denied this motion. The trial began on August 8, 2016, at the United States District Court for Illinois, because that's where Bartlow had filed suit. The artist, Peter Doig, testified that he had never been incarcerated, never attended Lakehead University, and did not begin painting on canvas until he went to art school in 1979. He did not paint the work in question, and that it would be unethical to attribute someone else's work to oneself. The week after the 7-day trial, the judge ruled in favor of Peter Doig. In general, we saw lots of reporting, with very little investigating. Early accounts showed that there was enough doubt for the outcome to be at least somewhat in doubt. It was that period of time when the artist was out on his own traveling around. The writers saw what the judge had seen when he refused to dismiss the case. After the trial, the art writers were squarely behind the artist in the prestigious gallery. The only case I found of actual investigative journalism was June 2016, when the New York Times asked Ontario authorities to search their archives for record of the artist Peter Doig being incarcerated there. They were able to search back to 1985, saying that the deeper search would take 6 weeks. So that was that. A little investigation would have shown the breakdown in logic that the question of mistaken identity caused after the summer of 2013. Pete had died the previous year, and the artist's legal team's private investigator had paid a visit to his sister. She had her brother's driver's license, and while there may have been similarity in the appearance of Pete and Peter, logic tells us this was simply a coincidence. No reputable media outlet should have suggested that the two men were the same person by then. Did the media leave out the most important aspect of the case? What received little, more often no ink, was the legal aspect. Under VARA, the Visual Artists' Rights Act, artists have the right to disavow authorship of a work. The exception would be if an author acted in bad faith, which doesn't seem to be the case here. Our own Dr. Yates was surprised that this case made it to trial and was relieved that Mr. Doig won. The future will tell if this sets a precedent for other such cases. Is reporting on art crime different from other crimes? Of course, this is a civil case, not a criminal case, but I think some suggested answers apply to both. Despite high monetary value, coverage was almost exclusively in the art section. Of course, the Doig case was covered in art journals, newsletters, and art newspapers, like ArtNet and the art newspaper. But that's expected due to how the outcome could affect other artists. Legal fees for Doig are estimated at around $2 million. Though the case was covered in mainstream media, it was almost always relegated to the art section, never in the front section, as it might have been for, say, a $10 million celebrity divorce or a piece of military equipment. While the art section might be a golden ghetto, it's not the main section of any newspaper. Why was a multi-million-dollar story, with very few exceptions, dropped there? The story has all the elements of a made-for-Hollywood movie. First, there's the rags to riches journey of the struggling artist Peter Doig. In 1993, he couldn't pay his bills. One morning, he was opening his mail, and the first envelopes contained bills. 2 were letters from credit card companies instructing him to cut up his credit cards and mail them back. But the last envelope held a check for £20,000. He had won the John Moore Prize. His life changed in a flash, and his career took off. Then there's the account of Pete Doig's sister crying on the witness stand as she told how much seeing her deceased brother's painting meant to her. It was worth more than the $10 million. Then there was the colorful gallery owner Pete Bartlow and plaintiff's attorney William Zeiss spewing one theory after another for Mr. Doig's denial of authorship of the painting. Last, there's the story of the two men. Both, in my opinion, talented artists, but ending up leading very, very different lives. You see, from several angles, this is an interesting and compelling narrative. Why didn't it make it to Section A? Perhaps if it had gone viral on social media, it would have, but it didn't. Other than an Instagrammer posting as Loyola Condenser, who attended most days of the trial and who wrote a blow-by-blow account. One theory for why this case wasn't covered in the first section of the newspaper or on social media might be as simple as the size of the numbers. An expert in appraisal testified that the painting was worth $10,000, but if Peter Doig claimed it as his own, it would be valued at between $6 and $8 million. Peter Doig's primary market paintings sell for $300,000 to $3 million. And in the secondary market, they've sold for as much as $25.9 million. In Washington, we have a saying, $1 million here and $1 million there, pretty soon you're talking real money. Still, as mentioned earlier, the high price point doesn't stop other stories from making it to the front page. There could be another intangible here, and this is anecdotal and only conjecture on my part. On YouTube, you'll find the dealer Bartlow's attempts to convince us that Peter Doig was the person jailed, including time-enhanced photos to show how that person calling himself Pete Doig might look like the famous artist Doig looks today. Of course, we know that's not the case. Still, in the comments section, we might just have an answer to the question of why the Doig trial was only news in the art world. Recently, we've seen a rise in populism globally. Might this contribute to a dispute over a luxury item receiving limited press coverage? Remember, Mr. Doig's paintings averaged $10 million. Unfortunately, he had to spend $2 million of that proving the negative. One thing was certain, coverage in the art section put the emphasis on art and not on the dispute. Thank you for your kind attention.